There is a wall in southern Egypt that tells you exactly why the greatest civilization on Earth collapsed, and almost nobody is allowed to read it the way it was actually written. It sits about 25 kilometers south of Luxor, carved into the rock of a small pyramid-shaped hill called Mo'ala. The inscription is over 4,000 years old. Tourists drive past it, most have never heard of it. And the man who carved it left a single sentence that, when you finally understand what he meant, rewrites everything you were taught about how ancient Egypt ended. The sentence is this: all of Upper Egypt was dying of hunger, and each person had reached the point of eating his own children. That is not poetry. That is not a curse. That is a provincial governor named Ankhtifi describing, in his own words, what he watched happen to his country. And here is the part the textbooks skip. Egypt did not fall to an invading army. It did not fall to a plague we can name. It fell to something the Egyptians themselves recorded over and over, in stone, in 3 separate locations, across thousands of years. They told us what killed their world. And for most of modern history, scholars decided to read those warnings as religious storytelling, as metaphor, as exaggeration. They were not exaggerating. They were recording. If you have ever wondered why a civilization that built the pyramids, that mapped the stars, that ran one of the most stable governments in human history, suddenly went dark for over 100 years, the answer is sitting on these walls right now. And by the end of this, you are going to understand the exact mechanism, the exact sequence, and the exact reason the official version still leaves a gap nobody wants to fill. If you find buried history as unsettling as I do, subscribe and turn on the bell before we go any further, because this is the kind of story that gets quietly buried. Let me show you what these hieroglyphs actually say. To understand the collapse, you have to understand what Egypt was before it. We are talking about the Old Kingdom. This is the Egypt of the Great Pyramid, the Egypt of Giza. For roughly 5 centuries, from around 2700 to 2200 BCE, Egypt was the most centralized, most organized state on the planet. One king, one administration, one god king at the top who controlled the grain, the labor, the army, and the calendar. The pharaoh did not just rule Egypt. In the Egyptian mind, the pharaoh was the reason the universe stayed in order at all. They had a word for that order: ma'at. It meant truth, balance, the correct functioning of everything. The sun rising, the seasons turning, the Nile flooding on schedule every single year, dumping black, fertile silt across the fields so the grain could grow. As long as the pharaoh kept ma'at, the world worked. That was the deal. That was the entire theological and political foundation of Egyptian civilization. And then, sometime around 2200 BCE, it stopped working. The central government in the capital city of Memphis dissolved. The line of god kings fractured. Power did not transfer cleanly. It shattered into pieces and scattered out to the provinces, to local strongmen called nomarchs, who suddenly stopped answering to anyone. For more than a century, Egypt had no functioning central authority. Historians call this the First Intermediate Period, a polite, bloodless academic name for what was, by the accounts of the people who lived it, a complete societal breakdown. The standard textbook explanation for decades was vague: political instability, weak kings, bureaucratic decay. The Old Kingdom simply ran out of steam. It is the kind of explanation that sounds fine until you actually read what the Egyptians wrote about it. Because they did not describe a slow administrative decline. They described an apocalypse. And here is where the misreading begins. The Egyptians recorded the collapse using the only language they had, the language of gods, floods, divine anger, and cosmic order. So when modern scholars first read these texts in the 18 and 1900s, they saw mythology. They saw priests writing religious propaganda. They saw a culture blaming the gods for bad luck. They filed it under literature and moved on. But that is exactly the mistake. Because when you stop reading these inscriptions as myth and start reading them as a technical record of an environmental catastrophe, they line up with the hard science perfectly. Every phrase that sounds like superstition turns out to be a precise, literal description of what was physically happening to the country. Let me show you the 3 clues. The Egyptians left 3 separate records in 3 separate places, written centuries apart. Read alone, each one looks like a religious story. Read together, they describe a single chain of events with terrifying accuracy. Here is the first. 1. It comes from that tomb at Moala, the autobiography of Ankhtifi. He was a nomarch, a regional governor ruling the southern provinces of Edfu and Hieroglyphs, right at the moment the Old Kingdom was coming apart. His tomb is unusually large, decorated with scenes of farming and processions, and covered in his own words. And those words are some of the most chilling testimony to survive from the ancient world. He writes that the sky was clouded and the earth was parched. He writes that everyone was dying of hunger on what he calls the sandbank of Apophis. He describes the whole country moving like a swarm of locusts, traveling upstream and downstream, desperate, searching for food. And then he says it. The whole of Upper Egypt was dying of hunger, to the point where people ate their own children. Now, for a long time, scholars treated this as standard tomb boasting. Egyptian governors loved to carve self-congratulating autobiographies onto their tombs to impress the gods in the afterlife. Ankhtifi spends most of the inscription telling us how heroic he was. I gave bread to the hungry. I gave clothing to the naked. I gave sandals to the barefoot. I never let anyone die of hunger in my province. He even calls himself the hero without equal, the beginning and the end of mankind. So the easy read is this. He is exaggerating the disaster to make himself look like the savior who fixed it. But that explanation has a problem, because the specific detail he chose to include is not a generic boast. He says the sky was clouded and the earth was parched. He is describing a drought, a failure of rain, and a failure of the river. And he is describing famine so severe it crossed into cannibalism, a detail no Egyptian would casually invent because it represented the absolute collapse of Maat, the ultimate horror in their entire worldview. And here is what makes it impossible to dismiss. Ankhtifi is not the only one. A worker connected to a priest at Koptos left his own modest inscription, saying he stood in the doorway handing out grain during what he called the painful years of famine. Centuries later, a farmer named Hekanacht wrote private letters, not monuments, not propaganda, just family correspondence, complaining that people had started eating each other. He even wrote, with grim precision, that one should only use the word hunger when it is real hunger, because in his town, they had begun to eat people. The same horror, different person, different place, different century. Not a boast, a pattern. And there is one more detail in Ankhtifi's words that you cannot skip past. He describes the whole country moving like locusts, going upstream and downstream. Now picture that, literally. That is a description of mass migration, of an entire population on the move, abandoning villages, walking the length of the river in search of anything to eat. That is not the language of a single bad harvest. That is the language of a refugee crisis spanning the entire country. When a society's food collapses, this is exactly what you see. People leaving the land, flowing toward wherever food might still exist, dying along the way. Ankhtifi watched it happen and described the motion of it, upstream and downstream, endless, searching. There is also a darker line worth sitting with. He says, the famine struck on the sandbank of Apophis. To us, that sounds like religious decoration. But to an Egyptian, Apophis was the serpent who tried to swallow the sun every night, the embodiment of chaos itself, the enemy of order. By placing the famine on the sandbank of Apophis, Ankhtifi is telling us this was not a normal hard year, This was Ma'at itself failing, the cosmic order coming undone. He is reaching for the biggest concept in his entire belief system to describe the scale of what he saw. That is not exaggeration for an afterlife audience. That is a man running out of words. That is the first clue. The hieroglyphs are describing a megadrought. Now watch what happens when we test that against the ground itself. Because if Egypt really suffered a multi-year drought severe enough to break the Nile, the planet should have left physical evidence, not in a temple, in the dirt, in the lake beds, in the ice. And it did. In 2012, researchers studying fossilized pollen and charcoal from sediment cores in the Nile Delta found exactly what Ankhtifi described. Around 2200 BCE, the vegetation record shows a sharp shift toward dry, arid conditions. The wetlands shrank. The plants that need water vanished from the record. Scientists studying Lake Fayum, a massive body of water, 65 meters deep, fed directly by the Nile, found evidence that it essentially dried up between roughly 2200 and 2150 BCE, the exact window when the Old Kingdom fell apart. This is part of something climate scientists now have a name for, the 4.2 kiloyear event, a catastrophic aridification event, a megadrought that struck around 4,200 years ago and lasted, by many estimates, most of an entire century. And here is the staggering part. It did not just hit Egypt. The same drought signature shows up in the collapse of the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia, in the decline of the Indus Valley civilization in South Asia, in the breakdown of the Liangzhu culture in China. 4 of the most advanced civilizations on Earth, on 3 different continents, all faltering inside the same climate window. The evidence for this is not a guess. It comes from physical proxies pulled out of the ground all over the planet. Oxygen isotope ratios locked inside cave stalagmites, which record how wet or dry the air was when each layer formed. Lake bed sediment cores, which preserve a year-by-year diary of water levels. Tree rings from ancient timber in Anatolia. Coral records, ice cores from Greenland, pollen trapped in mud. Independently, in dozens of locations, these records all spike toward dryness in the same window, around 2200 BCE. This was one of the most severe climate events of the entire Holocene, the geological epoch we still live in. It was so significant that geologists used it to define the boundary of a new age, the Megalion, which technically began with this drought. Think about that. The dry spell that broke Egypt was severe enough that scientists carved a new chapter of the planet's timeline around it. And the Mesopotamian parallel is almost too neat to believe. As the Akkadian Empire's northern farmlands turned to dust, archaeologists found those regions were physically abandoned, buried under wind-blown sediment, with refugees pouring south. The Akkadians even built a massive wall over 180 kilometers long to try to hold back the starving people moving toward the surviving land. They called it the Repeller of the Amorites, a desperate civilization throwing up a wall against its own collapsing neighbors. The same drought, the same migration, the same desperation, Ankhtifi described as locusts going upstream and downstream. It was happening simultaneously across the entire ancient world. The Egyptians did not have satellites. They did not have ice cores. They had a man standing in a province in Upper Egypt, watching the sky stay dry and the river fail, carving the words "the sky was clouded and the earth was parched" into a tomb wall. He recorded the 4.2 kiloyear event in real time. He just did not have the word for it. So he used the word he had, Apophis, the serpent of chaos. We call it a climate event. He called it the sandbank of the chaos serpent. They were describing the same thing. That is the first clue confirmed. Now, here is where it gets stranger, because the second clue tells us why the drought was a death sentence, and not just a hardship. For that, we go to a small island in the Nile near Aswan called Sehel, and to an inscription called the famine stela. It is carved into a giant block of natural granite, 32 columns of hieroglyphs, with a scene at the top showing a pharaoh making offerings to three gods. The text tells the story of King Djoser, the pharaoh who built the very first pyramid, the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, and it describes a disaster. 7 straight years, the inscription says, in which the Nile failed to flood. 7 years where the grain was scarce, the seeds dried up in the ground, and there was nothing left to eat. The king himself says his heart was in great pain because the Nile had not come in its time for 7 years. Now, the mainstream read on this, one is sharp, and you need to hear it because this is where honest investigation matters. The famine stela is a fake, or more precisely, it is a forgery in terms of its date. The carving itself was not made during Djoser's reign. It was made more than 2,000 years later, during the Ptolemaic period, around 200 BCE, by the priests of the god Khnum. And they almost certainly made it for a very practical, very cynical reason. They wanted to claim ownership over the lucrative region around Elephantine, and a story about a pharaoh granting that land to their god in exchange for ending a famine was the perfect legal fiction. Scholars even point out that the number 7 may be symbolic, a round number for completeness, not a literal count. So, one read is simple. This is a Ptolemaic land grab dressed up as ancient history. Case closed. But that explanation has a gap. Because of all the disasters those priests could have invented to justify their claim, they chose this one, a 7-year failure of the Nile flood. And the reason that detail matters is that it reveals something the Egyptians understood at the deepest level of their culture, across thousands of years. Their entire civilization lived or died on a single variable, not rainfall, not temperature, the height of the Nile flood. Egypt is a desert. It almost never rains in the Nile Valley. Egyptian agriculture did not depend on weather at all. It depended entirely on the river rising every summer and spilling over its banks, laying down fresh silt and water across the fields. Too little flood, and the crops failed and people starved. Too much flood, and the villages and canals were destroyed. There was a narrow band, a perfect window, and the entire survival of millions of people rode on the river, hitting it. The Egyptians were so obsessed with this that they built measuring devices called nilometers, staircases, and marked wells along the river, specifically to record the flood height each year. They were keeping data, hydrological records, for 3,000 years. Stop and think about how extraordinary that is. This was a civilization running a continuous environmental monitoring program for the length of its existence. They knew, from generations of records, what a normal flood looked like. They knew what a dangerous one looked like. They could see a bad year coming in the marks on the wall. They understood their dependence on this single number more clearly than most modern nations understand their own vulnerabilities. And that is precisely why the failure of the flood was the one catastrophe their entire culture was built to fear. They had been watching that number their whole history. They knew exactly what it meant when it dropped and stayed dropped. The famine stela, fake date and all, preserves the one fear that haunted every Egyptian in every era: the river not coming. And it pins that fear to Djoser, a king from the very beginning, and to a 7-year drought, which is precisely the kind of multi-year failure that the 4.2 kilo-year event would have produced. The priests in 200 BCE were reaching back into a cultural memory of catastrophe that was real, even if their specific stela was a forgery. The horror was inherited, passed down, burned into the civilization because it had actually happened. And notice who the stela says controlled the flood. Khnum, the ram-headed god, said to release the waters from a sacred spring at Elephantine, right at the southern edge of Egypt, where the Nile entered the country. In the story, the king cannot fix the famine by force or by decree. He has to find out which god controls the river and beg. That is the Egyptian mind admitting something profound. The thing that keeps us alive is completely outside our control. We can measure it, we can record it, we can pray to it, but we cannot command it. A civilization that could move millions of tons of stone to build the pyramids was, in the end, utterly helpless before the height of a river. And they knew it. The stela is them admitting it in the only frame they had. So now we have two clues lining up: a drought, recorded by a man who lived through it, and a national multi-millennial terror of the Nile failing, preserved in stone. But there is a third clue, and the third clue is the one that explains why the drought did not just cause hunger, why it caused the entire government to disintegrate. This is the part the official version barely touches. For this one, we turn to a text called The Admonitions of Ipuwer. It is a long poem surviving on a single papyrus describing Egypt turned completely upside down, and it reads like a nightmare. The text says, "The land has been robbed of its kingship by a few people who ignore tradition." It describes the Nile flooding, yet no one going out to plow because everyone says, "We do not know what will happen." It describes the poor becoming rich and the rich becoming poor. It says servants are now masters. It says the man who could not build a boat now owns ships. It describes tombs being broken open, the dead being thrown into the river, and the secret writings of the government being exposed and read by anyone. For a long time, scholars debated whether Ipuwer was describing a real period or just writing a piece of pessimistic literature, a kind of philosophical lament about the fragility of order. And there is genuine disagreement here. The papyrus we have was copied later, and dating it precisely is difficult. So you cannot simply say it is a journalistic account of the collapse. But look at what it describes and compare it to what we already know was happening. Ipuwer is not describing an invasion. He is not describing a war with a foreign enemy. He is describing the collapse of central authority and the total inversion of the social order. The state archives opened. The hierarchy flipped. Local people seizing what the king used to control. And that is exactly, precisely, what the archaeology shows happened. When the Old Kingdom's central government in Memphis lost its grip during the drought, power did not vanish. It moved. It flowed down to the local governors, the nomarchs, men like Ankhtifi. And here is the detail that ties it all together. In the final stretch of the Old Kingdom, the position of nomarch became hereditary. These governors stopped being appointed officials who served the king and started being independent local dynasties who passed power to their sons. They built their own large tombs in their own home provinces. Instead of being buried near the pharaoh, they raised their own armies. They controlled their own grain. Think about what the drought did to that arrangement. When the Nile failed and the grain disappeared, the one thing that mattered was who controlled food locally. The distant god king in Memphis could not make it rain. He could not refill the river. His entire claim to power, that he maintained Ma'at, that he kept the cosmos in balance, was shattered by a sky that stayed dry. So the people stopped looking to the pharaoh. They looked to the man next door who had grain in his storehouse. They looked to Ankhtifi, who could literally say, "I kept my people alive," when the king could not. That is the mechanism. That is the missing chapter. The drought did not just starve Egypt. It severed the link between the pharaoh and the divine order he was supposed to guarantee. The moment the god king could not deliver the flood, the entire theological foundation of Egyptian kingship cracked, and power drained out to whoever held the food. Ipuwer's upside-down world, servants becoming masters, the poor seizing what the rich once held, is the literary echo of a real political earthquake, the collapse of centralized divine kingship under environmental stress. And here is the part that should make you uneasy. The reunified Egypt that emerged later, the Middle Kingdom under the Theban kings, had every reason to make sure this story was remembered a certain way. They cast themselves as the heroes who restored order out of chaos, which means the version of the first intermediate period that survived was, to a real degree, shaped by the people who profited from calling it a dark age. The texts that painted it as pure horror were useful to the victors. The inscriptions that showed provinces surviving fine, like Ankhtifi bragging about a grain surplus, sat awkwardly against that narrative and got read instead as simple boasting. History, even 4,000 years ago, was edited by the winners. The mechanism of the collapse, the drought breaking the bond between king and cosmos, was real. But the framing we inherited was curated. That is why it has taken modern science, pollen and sediment and isotopes to reconstruct what actually happened underneath the official story. 3 clues: a governor recording the drought he watched, a stela preserving the nation's deepest fear of the river failing, and a poem describing the social order inverting exactly as the science says it did. Read as myth, they are 3 unrelated religious texts. Read as a record, they are 3 witnesses to the same death. Now, here is where I have to slow down, because if you have watched enough of these investigations, you know the next move is usually to claim something impossible. Lost technology. Aliens. A hidden super civilization. And I want to be straight with you, because the truth here is actually stranger than the fantasy. Does any of this prove some grand, suppressed secret, some forbidden knowledge the establishment is hiding from you? No, it does not. And the honest, skeptical position deserves a real hearing because it is strong. The skeptics make several good points. Ankhtifi was boasting, and Egyptian tomb autobiographies are notoriously self-aggrandizing. So his famine may be partly literary. The famine stela is a confirmed late forgery made for political reasons. Pure may be philosophical literature rather than reportage. And there is a serious school of modern Egyptology led by scholars like Thomas Schneider, arguing that we should drop the word collapse entirely. They point out that the famine inscriptions might be exaggerated, that some provinces actually seem to have done fine, and that Ankhtifi himself brags about producing a surplus and shipping grain both north and south. If he had grain to export, how bad was the famine, really? Their argument is that climate stress hit different regions differently, that the transition was messier and slower than a single dramatic crash, and that the Dark Age narrative was partly written by the Theban kings, who later reunified Egypt and had every reason to make the previous era look like chaos they heroically ended. That is a fair, evidence-based challenge, and you should hold on to it. The simple story of one drought instantly destroying Egypt overnight is too clean. It probably did not happen that fast, and it probably did not happen evenly. But here is what the skeptical read does not erase. The physical evidence is still in the ground. The pollen cores still show aridification around 2200 BCE. Lake Fayum still dried up. The 4.2 kiloyear event still flattened civilizations across 3 continents in the same window. The Nilometer obsession still proves Egypt knew its life hung on the flood. And the political record still shows the nomarchs going hereditary and independent right as the central state failed. You do not need cannibalism to be literal. You do not need the famine stela to be authentic. You do not need Ipure to be a news report. You only need the convergence. And the convergence is real. Climate, sediment, text, and political structure all point the same direction. So no, this is not a hidden conspiracy. It is something more uncomfortable than a conspiracy. It is the realization that the most powerful civilization of the ancient world was brought to its knees not by an enemy, not by a weapon, not by anything they could fight, but by the sky going quiet, by a river that simply stopped rising, and that they saw it coming, recorded it, and could do absolutely nothing to stop it. That is the chapter history left out. Not a secret. A warning. Because think about what that actually means. Egypt was not weak. Egypt was not primitive. Egypt was, by every measure, a triumph. It had organization, engineering, surplus, astronomy, medicine, and 5 centuries of unbroken stability. It was, in its own time, the closest thing to an unshakable civilization the world had ever produced. And a single shift in the climate, a drought that lasted perhaps a few decades, pulled the foundation out from under all of it. Not by destroying the buildings. The pyramids stood through the whole thing. They are still standing. It destroyed something more important. It destroyed the trust, the belief that the people in charge could keep the world in order. The moment the flood failed, the social contract failed with it, and the most stable state on Earth came apart in a single lifetime. And here is the question that should keep you up at night. The Egyptians left these records on purpose. Ankhtifi carved his famine into stone so it would last forever. The priests preserved the memory of the 7-year drought across 2,000 years. The Egyptians believed deeply that history moved in cycles, that what happened once would happen again whenever order broke down. They were not writing diaries. They were writing warnings. To the future, to us. So what exactly did they understand about how a civilization dies that we have decided to read as superstition? They watched the most advanced society of their age collapse because the environment shifted faster than the government could respond. They watched centralized power evaporate the instant it could no longer guarantee food. And they carved the whole sequence into the rock in the only language they had, and waited for someone to read it correctly. We are only now, with pollen cores and climate models and sediment data, catching up to what a provincial governor named Ankhtifi already knew 4,000 years ago. The sky was clouded, the earth was parched, and everything fell. The wall at Moala is still there. The granite at Sahel is still there, slowly eroding in the wind. The same wind the inscription warned about. The papyrus of Ipuwer still sits in a museum, still half dismissed as a poem. The warning Egypt spent thousands of years trying to preserve is still mostly read as mythology, still mostly walked past, still waiting for the world to take it literally. They told us how their civilization fell. They told us why. And they told us it would happen again. The only question left is whether we are reading it as a story or as a record. If this rearranged how you see the ancient world, do not stop here. The next investigation on screen goes even deeper into what these so-called myths were actually hiding. And it connects to everything you just learned. Watch it now before that one gets buried too.